Is it true humanity can bond with anything as long as it even has a marginal ability to talk and be perceived friendly? If you said anything other than yes, then you're a huge dork. Look no further than the greatest space bro humanity ever had, Garrus. This is displayed perfectly in Project Hail Mary. The reality of our social fabric is that humans look for our own behavior in other species all the time. Literally anything for us to latch onto to connect with. And this is why we can form bonds with cats, dogs, chinchillas, hamsters, birds, and even, sometimes giant cats like tigers, though that probably isn't advised. But again, if not friend, why friend shaped? It is the way of our brains, and ultimately what may have saved our species in the past, but also potentially in the future as well. As the sun began dimming for reasons unknown, a probe would be sent after discovering a line of infrared light emitting from a connection spanning the distance from Venus to the sun. Discovering what would be known as the astrophage, this would in turn appear to be causing the sun to dim, which would ultimately shrink the Goldilocks zone, freezing Earth out and leading to humanity's extinction. As a desperate mission would be launched to figure out how seemingly one sun should have this issue but doesn't, and it hasn't progressed, a man and a rock would unite to stop their respective planets from rendering their species completely bodied. So in today's episode, everyone and their mother has talked about Rocky's biology. I'm going to be real with you. And I mean, while it is interesting, I want to talk about the astrophage and how it could even evolve in the first place and how men actually been able to use its ability in order to reach not only space, but distant planets as well, as we cover Project Hail Mary. We kick off today's story with eye movement detected and math questions, my personal 8 a.m. hell back in high school. Being in an induced coma, carbs which fuels your brain over here, worms away from the machine as muscle function ain't doing so hot either at this current juncture. Climbing up a ladder and somehow not falling, he then goes to open pods, finding everyone with him is deceased. I guess you could say they were dying to get on this mission. Going to explore the rest of the ship, the lights are off and Bro's a bit confused on his location or even who he is. As he turns around, it's the one place not corrupted by capitalism. Space! Flying towards some sun. Warming up his brain, he then asks if he's smart before going into the panel room looking at the woods. Calming down for a moment, he now heads to the pilot section as he asks to speak to the person in charge. He asks where the living people are as nobody else is alive but him. Sitting in the seat, the pilot is detected as then he tells the machine to go home as he sees, oh look, it's the sun. Assuming he's probably just near Neptune, the message is going to take a while to get home as then he zooms out the map and sees, yeah, that's not our sun, that's another sun, and I'm pretty far from home. Ugh. Not a great way to wake up. Going back to the ship, he then looks at the fuel and starts mathing it out as it says it'll take 113.8 years to get home at this point, as then he starts crashing out about that. Flashing back to the past, humanity sent a probe to fly near Venus to figure out what the line was coming off the sun, as then they determine it's actually life. The scientist then runs off as we now learn sound waves are physical, and they are. Jumping over to a classroom, a girl then asks if the creatures are really eating the sun. Playing the beanbag is lava and avoiding the question, he then asks everyone else other questions to sort of, lighten the mood. They then get the beanbag and then ask him what the Petrova line actually is. Seeing a streak of infrared light from the sun to the Venus, not really sure why I call it the Venus, they think these are the organisms that are affecting the sun. However, Prometheus is being quite vague about it and says, well, I want to hear what your parents think about it because I don't want to be accused of telling you the world's gonna end. And also, I guess, because he doesn't want to freak out the younglings. Well, too bad. Freaked out they will be because they already know pretty much they're gonna die. Mainly because the planet freezes over. That's gonna probably also clue them in that something might be going wrong with the world. Talking about the dots, it is definitely life, as he tells them they seem to be dimming the sun by just a tiny bit. It's a moderate problem. The Earth could cool 10 to 15 degrees over the next 30 years. And, that doesn't sound bad when you're in the summer, right? Okay, it's 95 degrees outside, so 80 degrees summer. But an 80 degrees summer is the maximum. I mean, at least in the South, it ain't that warm. And then you're talking about, I remember it was 5 degrees this winter, so you're talking about -10. -10 is a whole different animal. It's cold. Anyways, being told the best minds are on it, so we don't have to worry about it, we then jump back to the present. Finding some vodka, he then eats some food, as in dry ramen, and then drinks a lot as he prepares the crew to be ejected from the ship. Having some memories of them, he keeps trying to figure out who he actually is as we get the element of surprise, and then dancing with the mop. Yeah, being alone that long will actually do that to you. You'll eventually start talking to volleyballs if you're not careful. And then jumping back to the past in the classroom, a woman then comes in who's just an absolute ball of humor and joy as she asks if Grace is responsible for his writings about how life might not just be water-based. Heading outside, she then tells him that she can give him the chance to defend his writings as Grace tells her nothing is magical about water. except possibly it is. Meeting Carl, she then tells him he needs to tell him how the astrophage actually works. Asking if the sun is really dying, Carl informs him, yeah, it really is. At a lab, he is asked to analyze a sample, as he then goes on to question if he's expendable or not. She turns and then gets the consensus that it would be better if he doesn't die. So he's like, all right, so I am expendable. Opening the sample, he discovers indeed the cells are alive because they, are moving. She then asks what they're made of, as he says bacteria took 200 years to understand. This might take him just a moment. Running through the light spectrum, he can't see into these things with any form of energy. Poking one, he then accidentally kills it and confirms it is a cell. It's just a tiny alien cell. So nobody did this prior. Realizing it died, now they can figure out what it's actually made of. Running through it, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, all of the classics, so it disproves all of his theories on water and says, yeah, this is also water-based. But I guess there could be other forms of life. I've heard silicon-based and ammonia-based. Of course, ammonia-based makes it really, really cold, so apparently that would take life a long time to actually develop. So sitting in a tunnel lamenting over his hypotheses, he is asked what he has learned. When the astrophage moves, they give off infrared light, and it's exactly the Petrova frequency. They consume the sun's energy and then expel it, moving to a new area. In this case, Venus to well, I can't tell you that part yet. Anyways, they toot to scoot. He has no idea what they went to Venus for, though. And I totally didn't just give it away right now. And then she says she's glad he didn't die, as then he chases her out, asking to go with her. And she's like, okay, well, I left you 3 dots to work with. And then she just straight bails out. Back on the ship, he then looks through the carvings, which in case we are ever found by an alien race, it's not good. But at least they would know what we were and that our planet froze. Which also, side note, we need to go retrieve Voyager. I'm going to be straight up honest with you. That thing that's out there, I'm not sure we need aliens knowing we exist over here at our current tech level, because it is just probably not going to be enough. Back at the lab, Grace then asks Carl why the astrophage would stop at Venus but not Mercury, even though it's closer. Asking if he has a budget, he is told no, but Carl has a budget. So they head to Home Creepo to stock up on some disturbing amount of duct tape to the outside observer. Back at the lab, they set up a test as everything is completely blacked out. Turning on the light, they left just the black dots. Putting that box inside another box and then seal up the lab as not to lose the dots. Being sealed inside, the lights are completely cut as he begins looking through with infrared light. Also, completely unrelated, did you hear red night vision goggles? I think it used red phosphorus in order to see. Soldiers were seeing demons and things in their vision that are deemed hallucinations. Very strange. But apparently that's why they stopped barking up the red night vision goggles, because they said it was too distracting for the people wearing them. That's horrific. Anyways, finding the dots in the darkness as they emit their own infrared light, they now have 4 dots, which shows Grace just figured out how to reproduce these things. Telling Carl their fathers, they then turn back on the lights as he calls Happy Sunshine Lady to tell her they figured out how it breeds. Putting Grace in a jet immediately, he is then flown to an aircraft carrier out in the ocean, as then he throws up in a cone, and is brought in to talk to the top world leaders and scientists. He then tells them that they need CO2 to breathe. Asking the real questions of if it engages in mitosis or meiosis, which, trust me, it does matter. Genetic diversity would make it much more difficult to kill, which would be meiosis. That's how it gets more genetic diversity. That's pretty much what creates us and multicellular organisms. Mitosis makes them more susceptible to any counters because they all have a similar genetic profile, but it allows them to proliferate much more quickly. So anyways, the astrophage, seeing the CO2 in the Venus box, that's why they chose Venus to go to breed. So I didn't give away too much information too quickly. Being asked how long it will take to make 2 million kilograms, Grace is granted top secret security clearance, which, when I watched this movie, I know some people. Anyways, they all laughed, saying that is not how it works. Obviously, that's not how it works. But, when the world is going to be ending, possibly, it's a whole different animal. So he's informed all the stars in the surrounding area have been infected and are dimming, except one. 11.9 light years away, Tau Ceti is uninfected, seemingly. The question is, why? Nobody knows. Astrophage is the fuel that they will use to get there, and there is not enough fuel right now for a round trip, and there shouldn't be, so astronauts sent will actually meet their end in space because they can't return home. The alternative is to do nothing and just starve, which sounds equally bad. Jumping back to the ship, Grace looks at the crew that was with him as then he loads them up. He then gives them a closing speech and launches them into space after telling them he will do his best. Well, do someone else's best. You know what? Why don't you go home for 2 days so we can catch up? So as he sits in the panel room, after that, he hallucinates someone coming to him, as then the ship starts telling him they are approaching Tau Ceti as the engines then shut off and gravity also turns off.
And now for something completely different.
But first, this episode is sponsored by Raycon. The essential open earbuds are a great option for everyday listening. Click the link in the description box and go to buyraycon.com/Roanoke Open to get 20% off. Thanks to Raycon for sponsoring. Raycon is disrupting the electronics industry by designing premium wireless audio for half the price without compromise. And with that, summer is fully upon us. It's right behind you. It's in front of you. It's all around you. It's 95 degrees all the time and everything is melting. But that doesn't mean you can't listen to absolute bangers while suffering from heat exhaustion. And the open earbuds are the perfect way to do it. Sitting just outside your ear canal, you can hear crystal clear music, but still have the awareness of what's happening around you. So let's say you're at like the pool and your friend is running up on you to push you in. You can out-juke them and then they fall in, and then you can laugh at them. Or you're out for an evening run because running at 2 p.m. will burn you to a crisp. You can hear the traffic around you so that you can stay safe while listening to your music. I personally like using mine at the gym because I can actually hear when people are trying to talk to me while also hearing the tinnitus in my ear scream at me, but also hear crystal clear music being pumped into my head. And with their lightweight, flexible ear hook, they adapt to any size ear very comfortably. Not to mention their 36-hour battery life, 8 hours of playtime, which 36 is in the battery case. I only gotta charge these things like once a week, and I get so much use out of it. So if you're ready to upgrade your audio game today, then go to buyraycon.com/Roanoke Open to get 20% off your Raycon order today. Latching onto the periscope, he then looks at the sun as he turns it infrared and sees it has its own Petrova line. Looking at it, there's a hole in the line. Seeing it's actually a ship out there, this would be quite the momentous occasion as it starts coming towards them, which would be horrifying. Looking at the window, it is a much bigger ship than what humanity had put together. Deciding nope, he then heads out, attempting to leave that thing behind as it now begins following him, asking what they might even want. It continues to follow him as it just sort of matches his movements. An arm that appears and throws something at the ship. Not knowing what it could even be, or it could be a message, or it could be a concussive force detonator, it then bounces off the ship as he's bracing for impact, which then noticing it didn't land, it then sends another one much slower. Grace then thinks about it and realizes they think he's dumb as he says, oh, I need to actually catch this thing, but it's going to require me to do a spacewalk. Suiting up, he then heads outside of the ship and manages to catch it before falling off the side. The ship becomes aware of where he came from at that point for later. Bringing the capsule in the ship, he then tries to open it as he tests it and see it's actually solid xenon, which should be a gas, but for some reason, again, it's metallic here. Jumping back to the production of the ship, he remembers the centrifuge and then he gets his ship rotating in order to reestablish some semblance of gravity so that he can use the lab. Immediately tripping, he tries again on the solid and sees it's still xenon. Turning it the other way, he opens it, immediately exposing himself to the alien atmospheres, and then getting it in the vent hood, he opens it further to see what the aliens were trying to show him, which is where they are actually from. Realizing they are from the Iridian system, I guess you could call it, they are a long way from home as well. Showing where he is from, he then goes and throws the capsule back to the alien ship. The Iridians respond by sending back another capsule, this time through the door, as they show the framework of the ship and some columns would emerge to build a walkable enclosure. Looking into the complete blackness, he enters the Tunnel of Wonders. Knocking on the wall that's somewhat see-through back there, an arm emerges behind it that scares the holy hell out of Grace. A hand emerges as it knocks back at him. Holding a model of Grace, it shows Grace's ship centrifuging and him going back to his ship. As it gets somewhat annoyed, he's not really getting the point. Giving the thumbs up, he goes back to his ship and then shuts the door. The walk is now pulled away as the alien ship begins to spin, mimicking Grace's ship from earlier. Doing the same, they then sync up as they will now create a form of gravity. Well, gravity adjacent. It feels like gravity somewhat. It's basically just spinning and centrifugal force that just compresses you. Anyways, grabbing a ton of stuff, the tunnel is then pressurized as Grace heads into the window, lighting it up. Seeing it as much more clear, he then knocks on it as he has set his camera up to kind of film whatever happens. Holding up some ramen, he made their ship as then he tapes it to the window. Seeing something on the other side, it touches the window as they look at one another. My God, he's a rock lobster perhaps. Waving at him, see, this is the issue with first encounters. It's really tough to know exactly how something is going to think about what you're doing. Like, let's say like for humanity, the reason we shake hands is like the real reason is to show that we don't have like a weapon in our hand. If you're shaking somebody's hand, obviously it's empty. So it's a sign of peace. But if an alien's made out of hands and that's like its face or something, if you grab their face, they're probably not going to be too happy about it and they're going to freak out. So it's just stuff like that. Anyways, so they have a moment where they freak out on one another as it mimics Grace's movements and dances. Proof humanity will bond with anything that even remotely likes to hang out with us. Approaching the window again, he looks at the creature but can't find a face on it. However, there are markings on its exterior. It begins saying something as it points. Grace then knocks on the window some more as it mimics his noise as well. It then points at the thing at the wall as he turns and sees what was left. Grabbing it, it's another present as he sees something was made. Grace doesn't have one of these at home, as the creature then tells him to take his helmet off. Saying it's a big ask, he doesn't want to do it as, as he finally is like walking away and then looks at the thing that he was given. 2 rings of 8. It's O2. Telling it's oxygen, he then tapes up the wires to keep the lights on as he decides maybe I should take my helmet off at the behest of this alien, showing that he can trust the random alien he met a few minutes earlier. What if it's just a prankster? Breathing the air, it is oxygen. And then heading into his ship, he looks at the thing the creature made and realizes the creature is there for the Petrova line as well. Step 1, though, they need to know how to communicate as it's, really hot on the creature's side of the ship and by comparison really cold on Grace's side of the ship. Wrapping up the tape measure, Grace then shows him a clock. As we see from the creature's side, it's a form of sound waves bouncing that shows what he is seeing. Calling him Rocky because he looks like a rock. Very, very, what's the word I'm looking for here? Creative. Grace then suspects echolocation as Rocky can see the clock. Showing him how to do the thumbs up, Rocky thumbs down due to the biomechanical constraints, as then he tells Grace to wait. Heading into his own ship, the clock then moves as Grace realizes they are both showing each other clocks. They are clock bros. Rocky begins pointing at his arm as a way to speak, as this really needs to be established. Starting with 1, they begin building a lexicon. Moving on to Rocky's name, it's quite extensive. Grace then tells him his name, and it's apparently a little less refined as Rocky responds. Understanding the need for the barrier, either's atmosphere would kill the other, as he thinks Rocky uses a metal form of Xenon to build things. Rocky's son is dying as well. Holding up the astrophage, Rocky then tells him it's bad. Grace then asks why Rocky is alone. There was apparently 23 of them, now there is 1. Asking what happened, apparently they just went to sleep and didn't wake back up. Asking him how they died, he doesn't know, but he couldn't wake them after they did. Grace is then asked how many humans there are, as he tells Rocky it's just him as well. Saying it's only us, Rocky then says they will save their stars. Fist bumping, they then make a deal as Rocky calls it fist my bump. Brother! Building a solar system, they need to build it as they begin learning about one another. Opening the voice version, they run through the voices and then pick the one that works best for Rocky. Telling him he has no idea why he's in space, Rocky says, well, you could just figure it out when you go home. Yeah, about that. Grace then shows he will go to sleep as Rocky is concerned he will die. Rocky says he must watch him sleep because it isn't safe. Rocky, I think, is just straight up traumatized by watching his crew sleep, as Rocky says he'd usually be closer than this. Iridium biology has them go into pretty much a coma so that they have to watch one another sleep in case there's danger they can wake the other up. Back at the creation of more Astrophage, back in the past, he meets the astronauts going to space, walking them through and being informed the astronauts are choosing how they will check out after the mission is complete. That's tragic. Less than a gram of astrophage can actually melt a metric ton of metal, by the way, and that is incredibly powerful. Checking out the results, Grace then tells the commander he's impressed by their ability to face death that way, as the commander says, there's no brave gene, you just have to find somebody to be brave for. Being pulled out of his memories, Rocky has arrived in a hamster ball that will allow him to survive Grace's frigid atmosphere. Exploring the ship, he then enters Grace's garbage room, as he calls it, as there will be room for Rocky to work in this area. Telling Rocky there are boundaries, he asks where his room is as Grace starts setting up an area for Rocky to work. Grace makes logs about how Rocky is pretty bossy. His eating habits are exotic as Rocky then eats and pushes his arm into his body, as Rocky can hear everything Grace is saying no matter where he is on the ship. Rocky creates something that can allow for him to actually hear screens, which I just connected. It's pretty much their form of a flashlight. Anyways, however, his species didn't have any theory of relativity and didn't know about radiation. Where Rocky was stationed on the ship, the astrophage actually absorbed the radiation, preventing it from taking him out. The rest of the crew would be exposed to pretty much cosmic radiation that was available in the environment, and that's what ended up cooking them from the inside out. So doing a puppet show for Rocky to show the plan, they will then use the planet's gravity to orbit the planet and figure out how to actually study why this sun isn't being eaten. Loading up, they then head to the sun as it shows what Earth actually looks like, as Grace is kind of been lying about returning home. Obviously, we know that. Rocky doesn't. And asking what Rocky misses about his home, he says he misses his mate, which I think he's been with her for like 180 years. Telling Grace his mate's name, he then asks if Grace has a mate. He tells him, well, she left me for Mark, as Rocky says he hates Mark. Based. Rocky then says he's been with his mate for a really long time as we flash back to the crew singing karaoke and coupling up. Heading to the top of the ship, Grace then goes and talks to a bucket of sunshine up there, as he says that is such a weird party. Everyone there knows they're going to meet their end, yet they still party, which, I mean, hey, I mean, everyone here knows they're going to meet their end. I know I'm going to die. You know you're going to die. We're all going to die at some point. Like, it's just, we don't live forever. Yet we still keep doing stuff. We still party. We just don't know when. It's virtually no different. Leaving her, he then heads back down to the party as the most emotionally warm German alive starts singing to everyone else and karaoke. Getting to the planet, it's green, like really green. Rocky says the planet is boring as it's named Tau Ceti E, just sun and then E added, so it's boring. Collecting samples of the astrophage, Grace has a moment as Rocky asks what he's doing. Closing the sample box, Grace says since they are the first there, they get to name it. Rocky suggests medium circle rough texture planet, an absolute classic, as Grace says, well, if that's already taken, what else would you name it? Suggesting Rocky made it, makes it personal, I guess. Grace suggests Rocky's mate's name. He says Adrian, as Rocky concurs, as the planet is now called Adrian. Grabbing the astrophage sample, they begin to test it and determine it is the same output as the input, meaning it's not uncontrollably growing unlike the other suns. Running further tests, they find that something on Adrian is actually alive. Rocky says life on Adrian is eating the astrophage. A microbial predator is knocking down the numbers, not dimming the sun. So they need to get a sample from the atmosphere, and showing Adrian fishing, they will make a chain to lower the collector to get samples. Now, in the book, apparently, this took like weeks to make this chain. Here, it doesn't take that long. Practicing his pilot skills, Grace tells Rocky that the Earth can't respond to Rocky as he talks to them because it is too far away. The signals would take forever to return, so they are really just recording these logs. Grace says they will then send these back in a probe, as this is a one-way trip for him. Rocky asks if Grace is going to die, as they don't have enough fuel to return. Rocky gets upset at this news, and then runs some calculations and says he has enough fuel for Grace to get home. Mainly because Rocky's people didn't have the theory of relativity, so they had way too much fuel for this trip, so he just has extra left over, but it'll get him home 6 years slower, but it really doesn't matter because he can get Grace home. So having a nice cry about it, they hug it out. Back on Earth in the past, as the astrophage has been completed, Sunshine then compliments Grace for his work as an explosion can be seen in the background. Someone messed up an order of magnitude on the astrophage, which then blew up the compound and took out the entire science team over there. Running towards it, it's a fairly massive setback. Back on the ship, they must now start the process of collecting the astrophage predator. Entering the upper atmosphere at an angle, they then use the engines to stop themselves from crashing into the planet itself. Lowering the fishing line, they then drag it through the atmosphere, collecting all the sample that they could need. Going to do the spacewalk, the sky is on fire, freaking out Grace as Rocky says words of great encouragement, which aren't really that encouraging. Going to pull up the collector line, Rocky is worried as the ship then starts straining from being in atmosphere. Pulling the line, the collector arrives to the amaze of Rocky as their altitude is becoming a bit of a problem. Dropping below the Aurora Borealis in this part of the galaxy at this time of year, Grace then gets hit with a piece of the ship breaking off, much to Rocky's concern. Knocking him down momentarily, Grace doesn't respond at first, as then he comes back to, as Grace then goes to get the collector. Rocky tells him they can try again later, don't go do that. Grace then goes for the collector as he's able to get it and then pull it back up. Cutting the line, he then throws the collector in the ship, and as they go to get out of there, the ship is being torn apart by the gravity of the planet, but probably more likely the atmosphere. They then fire up the engine to escape, but it's getting a bit too hot. Rocky then yells it's bad as the ship pieces are flying off. What a piece of ship. Anyways, turning off the engines, they appear to have escaped the orbit for a second as they begin falling back to the planet. Also not ideal. But luckily, but also not luckily for them, a hole developed in the fuel tank, which then tries to migrate towards this planet as Grace then goes to jettison it. In doing so, a centrifuge issue has been created, causing a massive amount of gravity as Grace is then knocked out, but this allowed them to escape the planet's orbit. Grace then wakes up to turn on the actual centrifuge to balance themselves out, but he can't cut it as Rocky is freaking out over there. Riding the vomit comet for a little longer, Rocky then breaks out of his shell, exposing himself to Earth's atmosphere, which probably burns like holy hell. Hitting the button, this then allows him to stabilize as he pulls Grace over to the machine to get that to work on him so that he doesn't die. Back over in the past, Grace then talks about how 1 nanogram wasn't enough to blow up the whole building. Instead, they were accidentally given 1 milligram. That tiny mistake is what caused that. So, assumingly, 2 million kilograms would probably detonate the whole planet. They still have to launch with or without the science team, as Grace is now informed he's going to be the one who has to go in their place. Telling him he's not an astronaut, he's not heroic, he can't even ride an elevator. He says he's not someone who rises to the challenge. Being asked to give up his life, he then asks to think about it, and he's given 3 hours to make a decision. Waking back up with the oxygen on, he then looks over to try to find Rocky, finding burn marks the whole way back through the ship. He then finds Rocky was able to actually get in his pod, but he's not looking so hot. As he begins shutting down, Grace tells him that he will watch him sleep so that he doesn't have to sleep alone. Telling him, though, he has to wake up later, they then centrifuge away from Adrian. He makes Rocky a heat lamp, amongst other things, as Rocky left him a message to save Earth and save Arid. Testing the astrophage, it is in fact being eaten by the microbes, so that's a pretty good sign. Naming the predator Taoeba, he then talks to Rocky further while he's asleep, saying, yeah, it's pretty lame that I named it Taoeba. Anyways, the Taoeba also cannot survive in nitrogen environments, which means it's probably not going to work well for Earth, and there is nitrogen on Arid, so it's not going to work well there either. However, through some engineering, he was able to develop a nitrogen-resistant amoebas using the breeding tanks that Rocky created out of solid Xenon, so each of their planets should allegedly be okay. So as the days pass, Rocky still has not woken back up, as this dude is like a freshman at a frat party, and like a freshman at a frat party, he wakes up weekly, reaching for water. Getting in his hamster ball, Rocky then wakes up Grace as they hug it out once more. Grace informs him he has succeeded in his task, and they have created all the amoeba that they will ever need. Telling Grace to fist his bump, they decide now that they need to party. Wearing the special clothing for celebration, they share hats and exchange gifts, giving him an Earth machine that's portable along with, the planet is lava, a hacky sack, so planet Earth. Grayson says it would be cool to see Rocky's ship as he's given a suit to enter that environment. Opening up the ship, it's all rings and lights, baby. So back on Earth, Grace made up his mind, telling the funniest German alive that he can't do it. He apparently is the solution, as she tells him the stakes are fairly high. Humanity is doomed because there is no chance that we will be able to ration food for other nations because it's just not something we would do. He says he doesn't have it in him, as then he goes to leave. He is then cornered. Being told to not make this more difficult than it needs to be, he is going one way or another. And being told he will be remembered a hero, even though he's acting kind of like a coward, which, I mean, I say that. I say he's acting like a coward. But, I mean, again, it's not a brave gene, it's just he has nobody to be brave for, so they're kind of just forcing him. So he gets outside as they're able to tackle him at the fence and sedate him as he yells to Carl, but bro, Carl is in on it. Carl then tells him he knows who he is, he's going to do great. So exploring Rocky's ship, Grace remembers that he was a coward, bummer bro, and saying his goodbye to Rocky, they won't see one another again as long as nothing crazy and unforeseen happens. Rubbing his arm, the long goodbye commences as then he dances at Rocky, and then cutting the tunnel loose, it separates the ships as they thumb down one another and both head back to their respective planets. Sleeping, Grace is then awoken by alarm flashing. A contaminant has been detected. The nitrogen amoeba has broken free of the Xenon tanks. Clearing the ship of all air, Grace then begins working on it and finds that there is in fact this leak. The amoeba adapted to the Xenon, and for Rocky, his entire ship is made of metallic Xenon, so the amoeba will completely eat it. Or seemingly eat it. Either way, it's going to escape containment anyway, so he's going to get back to Arid and not be able to save it. So, not good. And if he doesn't go get him, Rocky will deal with a slow, painful death because his ship will very likely be immobilized. Doing some math, it's going to take about 56 days to get to Rocky. So he can't do both. Is it home or is it Rocky? So he decides to do the Alpha Chad thing because he has somebody to be brave for, and then loads up the samples and logs in a probe and sends it back to Earth. Launching the pods, he then turns and heads to go save Rocky. Counting off the day, he then looks for him in the stars, and as he approaches, before finally finding him in the distance. Approaching the ship, he then lights it up and then heads over, doing a nice spacewalk. Entering it, he knocks on the wall, not sure if he's alive or not. Banging on the surface with a wrench, he then sees him in the back of the tunnel. Floating towards him, Rocky is still alive as he says something, but who knows? Back on Earth, the German woman is much older. She watches the logs, seeing he succeeded in his task, as he tells her she will figure it out. So before moving on, one of the things I want to talk about real quick, I know we're like right here at the end of this summary, but it was one of those things conceptually I noticed in the movie versus the actual idea of traveling faster than the speed of light. They're not necessarily traveling faster than the speed of light. The astrophage gets them up to near the speed of light, if I remember correctly. So one of the things is he's 113 years away at standard speed, right? And even though, here was kind of the weird thing that I noticed about this. And this may sound weird, but it's actually not that weird. Tao said he was 11.9 light years away, and they got there in like 4 years and some change or whatever it was. The thing to remember is it did actually take them 11.9 years to get there from the perspective of somebody on Earth. In the ship, it only took 4.8 years because time passes slower for people who are going near light speed versus people who are observing it who are not going light speed. So that's something to remember about that. So just a bit of a discrepancy you may have noticed. And then getting back would take 113 years because you would not be traveling fast enough with the astrophage. Instead, you would just be getting up to slightly speed, and then you would just be riding that out the rest of the time. So it wouldn't get you there as quickly. That's why all that happened. It's based on physics and the speed of light. And as you approach the speed of light, time slows down for the observer who is basically approaching that speed versus the outside who observes it is they're essentially going slower. Anyways, figured I would tell you that. So the Earth appears much colder now as they begin breeding the Taoeba in order to save the sun. With the Petrova line destroyed, Grace now wakes up in his own house. The robot is there as there is then a knock on the door. Walking out, Rocky's there asking what took him so long, telling him to close the door because he made it, and then walk out as the water is apparently very cold. Rocky says Adrian will work on the water temperature, and then sitting on the beach, the Hail Mary is apparently ready to go home as the Iridian scientists have figured it out. So as Grace sits there, he asks if he can think about it as Rocky tells him to think about it for a long time. Heading to a classroom essentially is just educating another species, which ironically, our race would actually be further along the relativity ideas, so this could be very useful for them, but thus concludes Project Hail Mary. You know it, I know it. The reality is everyone and their mother has covered Rocky's biology, and actually it is super interesting. The gist of it is basically an organism whose internal organs actually secrete armoring that is rock-like, basically. It appears to be Xenon, so it's not just a rock in there, it's also like functioning systems, electrical systems, well, not really electrical, it's a nervous system, as well as like obviously cells that are like endothelial that are going to actually secrete this stuff. So it's not just a rock in there. But their sleeping basically shuts them down, as the organism is then sending cells to repair different areas. But given that it's been done to death, even with the movie not that old, the one thing I haven't seen too much about is the actual astrophage, which given that's the, antagonist of the man versus nature type of deal, that's what we need to discuss because there may be some confusion as to how it exactly is happening or took place at first. Because if you look at it through the lens of life, it doesn't really seem possible if you think about it. I mean, with cosmic radiation, the vacuum of space, and the interstellar distances, I mean, I'm no doctor, but that was one clean infection of the sun. So how did it really take place then? Well, the first thing to understand about the astrophage, which I think was really where we should begin, is its actual evolutionary origins, which will help us to further explain exactly how it was able to leave and then resist radiation that was just bombarding it, because realistically, alarmingly, this isn't as impossible as it may seem. Just the right circumstances and the right environmental pressures pushing it to new heights, literally in this case. And then we'll go into its internal biology and why, beyond just breeding, it's choosing high CO2 planets, which we know is breeding, and why Venus specifically was an absolute baller of a choice for it, but not for us. So to kick off this science portion, I'm kind of surprised that Rocky was shocked that there was life on Adrian, to be honest. I mean, he's a rock. And if it can happen on his world, and apparently on our world from his perspective, then what's there to be shocked about? I mean, life is already confirmed at that point. If it can happen twice, then it can happen within 20 light years of one another. So it can for sure happen elsewhere. And this would indicate that life is fairly common in the galaxy, I guess you could say. But when life was discovered on Adrian, it's important to remember that the surface of this planet was about radiator hot. Roughly about 210 degrees, which is just below boiling water levels, which actually is rather important. See, when you have water boiling, or about to actively boil, that is incredibly unstable for life to form around. While the water levels are near it, the planet would never really get hot enough on the surface to fully boil it, but just almost there. The atmosphere consisted of high CO2 levels on Adrian, and much like any other planet, depending on which part of the atmosphere you reside in, the temperatures could be cooler the higher you go. In fact, it is known that if we ever want to colonize Venus, if we went up to about 31 to 34 miles high, or roughly 50 to 55 kilometers in heathen units, then at around 31 miles, there is about 1 atmosphere of pressure, but it's still rather warm at around 140 to 167 degrees in the based Fahrenheit. And what I can only imagine someone insane coming up with, like, "Oi, bloke, it's 4 Celsius, isn't it?" That's around 60 to 75 Celsius at that height. Move just 3 miles higher, and the pressure halves, but it hovers around 77 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or around 25 to 35 degrees Celsius. Realistically, at that height, it is equivalent to around 18,000 feet of pressure on Earth. So the air would be thin up there, much like it's, thin here. However, you would need an oxygen apparatus anyways in order to breathe on Venus. So you could exist in that pressure without there really being any issues as long as you had enough oxygen. But if we could build floating cities, there would really be no reason why Venus's upper atmosphere couldn't be totally habitable for humanity as long as we get enough oxygen. Now, and, I don't know, we'd have to build a ceiling because we'd have to resist radiation, which brings us to the next issue. Now, Venus has what is called localized magnetic fields. Earth, being the absolute goated Chad that it is, has an all-encompassing magnetic field which protects us from solar radiation, and the sun's heliosphere actually surrounds the entire solar system, keeping out a lot of cosmic radiation, so I guess we should be happy for the sun. Venus, however, must contend with radiation from the sun, more so in the upper atmosphere, because there is not much blocking it as far as like the charged particles, the magnetic field, I guess. It's not there in some areas. So the reason I'm talking about Venus so much is because this must apply to Adrian as well, given the astrophage's ability to actually deal with the radiation from Tau Ceti. It is very unlikely that Adrian actually has a magnetic field that would allow for too much protection, which in turn would actually limit the astrophage's ability to go out into space. Of course, ironically, that may be what's keeping the entire planet single-celled life. You need a magnetic field to actually have complex multicellular life, otherwise some issues could arise. So what it appears to me is we have a planet that is dealing with much higher temperatures that is forced into the upper atmosphere, or at least the astrophage is, of its world. It's not the pressure cooker that Venus is, but this in turn, over the course of the astrophage's evolution, causes it to become a transient extremophile. It can deal with higher temperatures, and clearly it can deal with cooler ones as well, but in the upper atmosphere of Venus, it could also find a sweet spot in which its internal chemistry would not be cooked and its proteins would not be denatured. On Earth, it's important to remember there are tons of microbes in the upper atmosphere. We've actually found bacteria in its endospore stage all the way up in the stratosphere, actually, probably due to thunderstorm activity, called like the upwelling, essentially. So an active ecosystem up there is not unheard of. This in turn does expose the microbes to more radiation, which much like on Adrian, would induce the exact adaptations that we see that make it such an issue. Existing in the upper atmosphere of Adrian, getting blasted by not only UV radiation, but also solar particles, which are highly radioactive, as well as X-rays and gamma rays hitting the upper atmosphere. The main issue with life being in the upper atmosphere is because of just everything offering less protection. As you move deeper into the atmosphere, like downwards, some of the radiation is going to get blocked by just the natural accumulation of gas and clouds. At the top, there is much less than this. I mean, look no further than a cloud on Earth moving in front of the sun when you're outside in July. Suddenly, it's much cooler. You could thank the cloud for literally blocking radiation. The same principle is on Venus and on Adrian. By getting blasted with radiation, seeing that the chemical makeup of the astrophage actually is carbon-based, utilizing water as well, radiation in theory should be deadly to it, and yet it doesn't annihilate it. So the question is why? Well, when we look at plants, compare that to, say, like a human. Imagine for a second, you stand outside all day, every day, buck nude. You are going to get a very unfortunate sunburn only about 2 hours into that venture. Eventually, your skin will become so damaged it'll probably just start peeling off of you, and I would really be surprised if you lasted even a year being exposed every day to that much solar radiation. Now look at a plant. These guys are outside all day, every day, getting blasted by not only UV radiation, but visible light, infrared, and other types of radiation that do make it through. Truly, the goats of tanning. But therein lies the connection. A plant cell is not also technically green, and yet it appears green. Why? Well, pigmentation known as chlorophyll is the answer. Within the plant cell are things known as chloroplasts that contain this pigmentation of chlorophyll. These are organelles whose whole purpose is to turn the sun's energy into chemical energy so that the plant can survive. Now imagine if the plant couldn't survive in the sun, yet it needs the sun. It's not really great. I mean, even our own cells, we produce vitamin D from the sun. So if you're ever like chronically low, or you're feeling depressed, or emotionally unstable for some reason, let's go out in the sun for a little bit. I'm not saying it's going to fix everything in your life, and I'm not saying it's going to completely stop depression or something like that, but SAD, as it's called, or seasonal affective disorder, is connected to the sunlight, obviously, and you should check your vitamin D levels to see if those are high enough, given that you may not be in the sun as much. So anyways, the reason plants are green is because the pigment is actually reflecting green light, so it's not being utilized. The other wavelengths are utilized much more readily, specifically red and blue being the colors that are kind of absorbed and utilized for their energy. So what does this have to do with the astrophage? Well, when we look at the cell body of the astrophage, it's actually quite literally absorbing the entire light spectrum. That's why it appears black. And with that, it is very likely also absorbing other higher orders of radiation like UV, gamma, X-rays, and interestingly, given its ability to survive in interstellar space, cosmic radiation as well. The organelle of its own body, instead of like appearing randomly throughout as little factories, like the thylakoid membranes, which are stacked chloroplast structures, it's actually very likely coating the entire side of the cellular membrane. The organelle sits just behind the cell membrane as a second layer whose whole purpose is to actually absorb incoming radiation, which in turn would protect its own genetic profile from being destroyed by the same radiation. So the thing to remember about life is it adapts to its environment. Take bacteria in the ocean that has now adapted to eating plastic. Nobody saw that one coming, but eventually it may end up cleaning the oceans if we can stop dumping trash in the rivers for like 14 seconds. Looking at you, India, I'm not saying the US doesn't do it. It's just y'all are going wild over there and you need to clean your friggin' rivers. But the reason it adapted to do so is because trash and plastic are abundant. It's a resource not being utilized, and the first organism to adapt to it and use that as a resource is the one that would have a much better chance at succeeding. That's what bacteria ended up doing. Astrophage is no different. As it existed in its ecosystem exposed to higher levels of radiation, it in turn would develop this black coloring in order to absorb that radiation. From here, chemically, it's not much different from a plant cell in many ways. Now, the elephant in the room is its almost impossible efficiency of storing and then using that energy. The chemical battery it possesses in order to store radiation and then use it clearly has to do with the capture of photons, but not just the excitement of electrons. In plants, sunlight energy will actually excite electrons on water molecules, and this will help reduce CO2, allowing them to actually produce glucose out of it and then expel O2 because it needs the carbon. It's a very simplified breakdown, but for our purposes here, it works. Astrophage very likely is using the same method chemically in order to undergo mitosis in the upper atmosphere of Adrian. However, there is a second system that exists that the same radiation is used for, and this is actually movement. When exposed to radiation, chemically they draw energy from it very clearly, using the CO2 method of creating energy like plants do so that they can undergo mitosis. There is a small amount of water vapor actually on Venus as well. In fact, if you could cool the planet down to like Earth status, apparently you could make a global ocean about a few feet deep. Obviously, there would be high points, which means in other areas the water would be deeper, but just know there is enough water to cover Venus just in its atmosphere alone, and that is what the astrophage is using in order to give itself free energy to grow out of control on Venus, which we will get to the predators here momentarily. The second form is the actual photons captured, and this one is a bit more difficult to conceptualize as the photons are physically captured. While they technically speaking have no mass, given that they are both a particle and a wavelength, they do have momentum to them. The one possibility I see for how these astrophages are able to actually move is they literally blast photons out the back of them, which then provides thrust. Now, this may sound completely insane, but actually it doesn't violate Newton's third law, which every once in a while I'll take a look at the microwave engine or the electro-microwave engine, I think it's called. It's basically Wile E. Coyote physics. It's super interesting. So Newton's third law states for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? Well, with the microwave engine, as the microwaves are blasted out, it then hits a plate on the other side, and it has been shown it can produce forward force. It is a minuscule amount of force, and some debate if it's actually doing it at all, but allegedly it has been shown. Now, what's the use if it's that small? In a near frictionless environment of a vacuum, I say near frictionless because there are still small particles in space, and just, also other particles that's just really, really spread out. This microwave engine, run for long enough, will produce a considerable speed and have you actually start gaining fractions of the speed of light. Again, it's Wile E. Coyote because it's a similar idea to like if you blow in your own sails, it should produce net zero force. Like you blowing should push you backwards, which that sounds phrasing, and then the sail being blown produces forward. Those should cancel out. But for some reason, with the microwave engine, it doesn't. So possibly something we might be able to use in the future. Right now, it's just not strong enough to be reasonable. But it is an interesting concept nonetheless because I'm not saying it violates the laws of physics. And there's probably physicists out there who also don't think that it does. But it is skirting a line here. Anyhow, as a very small amount of force is expelled out the back of the astrophage from capturing photons, this preservation of momentum blasts them outwards at an incredible speed. And this would mean that photons captured are still moving within the cell and not interrupted or stopped and then directed through the cell to produce directional movement. And this is going to be very important here in a minute. So it is unknown how this adaptation would develop, to be honest with you, but when it did develop, this allowed for new areas to be acquired. Much like any species moving from one area to another, sometimes they can be better suited for the environment just by chance entirely. The lionfish in the South Pacific gets bodied regularly because there's tons of predators that eat it. However, once introduced into the Caribbean, it is outbreeding and outcompeting every other fish, which is a problem, which is why there are constant hunting parties set up to clear them out. In fact, there's tourist fishing where when you go down there, they literally give you a spear gun to go and kill lionfish. Now, you might think that's cruel or terrible or blah, 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 but the reality of the situation is it was our screw up that the lionfish even got there in the first place. And it is actually, if we do not get it under control, it's going to render other species extinct. So what's less cruel? Allowing the lionfish to live, or basically culling them and then allowing like several other species to continue to live in an area that they evolved in? But anyways, humanity is pretty much their only predator at this point. So extrapolating this out to the astrophage, at some point in the past, maybe to escape a predator, maybe to just being a little more high up in the atmosphere than normal, the astrophage would then head out into space near the sun. Remember, it's not going into the sun and then eating like the sun, stopping nuclear fusion. Instead, it is existing around the sun. However, there is still a crux of the issue. The astrophage still needs to come back to Adrian in order to reproduce. So let's say 1,000 astrophage make it to Tau Ceti. As they orbit, they now produce, or they gain enough energy to basically come back with 1,000, and then they produce 10,000 astrophage on Adrian, right? So before the next escape the planet cycle begins, or if there even is a cycle, it could just be continuous, 9,000 of them get eaten. So then, since 9,000 of them are eaten and they're not existing anymore, only 1,000 make it back to the sun in order to reproduce. This ebb and flow in the population functionally stops the overproduction of astrophage and allows for an equilibrium to be reached. Now, before moving to the Ultra Chad Sol system, which is ours, we have to answer, how did they survive the sun in the first place? And how did they get to other suns? Well, it's important to remember, space isn't hot. It might seem like it is because, if you ever watch this channel, it's just people getting blasted by solar radiation and burned to a crisp. But space itself isn't very hot. Even, if you're facing the sun, like let's say you're out in space, the front part of your body is going to be just absolutely baked. But the back part of your body is going to be like negative 200 degrees. So it's how radiation falls that heats things up, not the ambient area around. So even around the sun, again, there's no ambient heat. There's just particles hitting a solid surface more regularly than heating it up. Given the photons can be used without impeding their motion, this would mean that somehow the astrophage is able to create a near frictionless environment in itself. No friction, no heat exchange. And this is the near impossible efficiency I'm talking about. Therefore, it can be directly in front of the sun, but not heating up. And given it's selectively absorbing radiation from the sun, it's important, one being like the infrared radiation, as this is what provides heat to other planets, and as long as there isn't a giant space algal bloom in the way, a smaller population of astrophage can exist without sucking up the sun's energy too much. So, how do they get to other suns then? Remember the picture of two people coughing on one another in the spray patterns back in the year of our Lord 2020, showing not to go to Joann's craft store and eat all the glitter? That is basically what's happening with the astrophage. As they go to gather energy from Tau Ceti, probably all the time really, this creates a constant stream of astrophage blasting in a shotgun pattern away from Adrian. Some are bound to miss the mark entirely. As they miss the sun, they get blasted off into interstellar space and continue drifting through with no heading until they finally get close to a heliosphere. By just pure luck, they then land in one where they begin receiving solar radiation once more, and with that, photons. If the astrophage is still alive, which they may even have an endospore stage like bacteria does, then they may reawaken. Which, for your edification, we have found viable endospores millions of years old on our planet. That they still were able to be brought back. And this is basically when bacteria is in an extremely hostile environment, it will desiccate itself and then turn its genetic coding into a very, very tightly wound packet, as then it uses virtually no energy to just exist. It can then exist in this state seemingly indefinitely, waiting for better environments to present themselves. We also find them in the upper atmosphere, as mentioned. And given astrophage can actually move at near the speed of light, you aren't talking about millions of years for it to cross interstellar space. You're talking like maybe 20 years for it to get here if it's moving at even like 60% the speed of light. So as Adrian orbits the sun, this stream is getting blasted in all directions as it orbits. Then it hits another solar system where there's a CO2 planet near the sun. As it then blasts off from those next and misses the mark, it then infects another solar system, and then another, all at different angles and distances because of how the galaxy is oriented and how those solar systems in it may not all be orbiting in the same direction on just one plane. It's basically by complete chance, but as the number of star systems infected grows, the more it is able to infect. This is simply the beginning of the issue, and it's kind of hard to tell really, but it seems like probably within I would say in Project Hail Mary, the last 100 years that this new adaptation formed. So as it infects the solar system, or at least the star system in general that it's in, there is no Taoeba in our system to keep the population in check. So 1 becomes 2 at the next cycle. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8. Literally, just by this happening 24 times, assuming this is a quick process and Astrophage isn't really dying at this point, 1 Astrophage becomes 10 million after just 24 times. 10 more times, it becomes 7.2 billion. And after 50 iterations after that, you're talking 19.34 septillion cells, given there are no predators to keep this thing in check. And again, that's not saying that they die, because we really don't know how they die. We just know they can be eaten or we can poke them, and that's about it. So and also, look at the mitosis, dude. Just by being in a box, 1 pops up almost immediately. That's really, really fast. So the astrophage isn't eating the sun, but it is building up in a way in front of the sun, absorbing radiation, specifically infrared radiation, which in turn begins freezing out the rest of the planets, as the sun eventually would be completely inundated with this invasive species, creating what would look like a black hole, but really it's just a shell of astrophage blocking out the sun. Which actually, given that we now know that, it may be up to the Iridians and humanity to kind of go check on the other suns if we could do it, because there could be other life that may just not be able to deal with the problem, and then you're losing entire species after that. So it'd be oh crap, now we need to look at these other suns. And honestly, you would almost need to inundate the entire, every CO2 planet with a type of Tau amoeba to deal with the issue, if you wanted basically suns to not disappear from the sky. But anyways, when I was a scientist, I'd actually see this happening all the time. Colonies of microbes would build up on Petri dishes, and if you let them go long enough, they would just completely sap the area of nutrients to their own detriment as an overgrowth issue. And this would render the area sterile, and them dead, because there was simply way too many of them. Hopefully this doesn't happen to humanity, but we'll see. Not you and I, but someone at some point is going to see that. Hopefully not, though. And this is why predators are important. There must be something that takes out the overproduction of a species. The Tau amoeba serves that purpose and ensures that Adrian does not freeze out too. And really, if you wonder what happens to the predators, it's oh, well, what if they over-reproduce? They won't, because if they over-reproduce, then they'll just eat too much of their prey, and then they'll die out. So the astrophage is simply a species that adapted to a high radiation environment. It is very likely using 2 forms of energy, chemical and photon based. The chemical branch operates like a plant. It would allow for it to reduce CO2 into energy using the water vapor on Adrian and on Venus. It can then undergo mitosis as it heads into space again and gathers more energy for the next cycle. And this uses the second branch, which actively uses photons' momentum in order to propel itself. Its black appearance is likely an organelle to absorb the radiation, and when poking it, it destroys the organelle, revealing it is simply just a cell underneath. And that just kind of grows out of control like any other cell would in any other environment with high nutrition and 0 predators. By introducing the Tau amoeba into Venus's atmosphere, it is basically the perfect way to introduce stability, because the astrophage can exist on Venus, so too can the Tau amoeba. And while at first the Tau amoeba may not be very many, once you see the atmosphere with it, eventually there's going to be so much nutrition around it, it will explode in growth. The Tau amoebas eventually will stabilize, and then the astrophage will actually shrink in growth because it's being eaten, which then the Tau amoeba will then shrink as well. So this would provide an ecosystem for Venus where there is a predator and there is prey, preventing it from essentially becoming a giant algal bloom in space, blocking out the sun's energy. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then please leave a like and a comment. As I have stated, YouTube straight up switched over to an AI algorithm back in May, so now it reads likes and comments as any metric to go by. Anything else really doesn't matter. You could have 1.4 million subs or 1.24. I think about 1.24. And it doesn't really care if you guys subscribe to the channel. It just cares if you find the stuff interesting, which, I guess that is kind of the whole purpose. Anyways, I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales, and Instagram links down in the description. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. At the astronaut tier, we have Army, Kusith, and Teacher. Thank you guys for your awesome continued support. At the Astrophysicist tier, we have Death Dancer, Webitron Supreme, and Commander Bothael. Thank you guys as well. And at the Scientist tier, we have the Chat of Chuts, Metric System, Invictus Echo, Official Texan, SSJ4 Lotus, and Gina Lane. Thank you guys as well. And the rest of my patrons, I really do appreciate y'all's support. It goes a long way towards keeping things running, so it's definitely greatly appreciated. All right, that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.